Somewhere in a climate-controlled warehouse in Japan right now, there is a fleet of Nissan Skyline GT-Rs sitting perfectly still, engines silent, odometers frozen. Not because anyone forgot about them, but because their owners are deliberately waiting, counting down the calendar to the exact day each individual car turns 25 years old. The precise moment United States federal law will finally allow it to legally cross the ocean and touch American pavement for the very first time. And that image, warehouses of six-figure Japanese supercars sitting in storage purely because of a birthday, tells you almost everything you need to know about where the collector car market actually stands right now in 2026. Because this is not simply nostalgia repeating itself the way it always has. This is a genuine structural shift in what counts as a classic car, who is buying them, and why. A shift that industry data suggests is running alongside a European classic car market, now valued at roughly 9 billion euros, and growing at more than 11% annually. And to understand just how significant this shift has become, you first have to understand what's happening to the cars that used to define the entire hobby for most of the 20th century. Because according to Hagerty, the insurance company that tracks collector vehicle values more closely than anyone else in the industry, its index tracking 19 of the most desirable American cars from the 1950s has fallen to a 5-year low, dropping 8% over just the past 12 months. A genuinely striking decline for cars that spent generations sitting comfortably at the very top of the hobby. The kind of blue-chip machinery that once anchored every serious collection, regardless of what else it contained. And that softness isn't limited to 50s chrome and tail fins either. Because Hagerty's broader measurement of the 100 most commonly insured collector vehicles, once worth more than $50,000 on average back in 2022, at the peak of a pandemic-era buying surge fueled by cheap money and plenty of newly idle free time, has since fallen to just over $43,000. And when adjusted for inflation, that figure now sits at an all-time low, and numbers that would normally suggest a hobby in genuine decline. A warning sign for anyone who assumed the collector market only ever moved in one direction. Except that's only half the story. Because, at the exact same moment, those historic segments have been quietly cooling. An entirely different category of car has been surging, and it starts with demographics. Because, as the CEO of Hagerty himself has publicly explained, the collector car market's traditional buyer base, the baby boomers who spent decades chasing the muscle cars and classic roadsters of their own youth, are now aging out of active collecting, downsizing their garages and their ambitions, and the buyers stepping into their place, members of Generation X, along with older millennials and even younger Gen Z enthusiasts just beginning to enter the hobby with real disposable income for the first time, simply didn't grow up dreaming about the same cars. And that generational handoff explains almost perfectly why the market's center of gravity has shifted so dramatically toward performance icons from the 1990s and 2000s, cars with exactly the kind of raw, unfiltered driving experience that a generation raised partly on video games and partly on increasingly digital, increasingly automated modern cars has started actively craving, a generation that also happens to be far more comfortable discovering and researching a potential purchase entirely online before ever seeing the car in person. And nowhere is that craving more visible than in the Japanese domestic market import boom currently reshaping garages across the country. Because for decades, some of Japan's most legendary performance cars, the Nissan Skyline GT-R chief among them, were simply forbidden fruit in the United States, built exclusively in right-hand drive for the Japanese market, and therefore permanently blocked from legal American roads, until a federal exemption kicked in, one that allows any vehicle at least 25 years old to bypass modern safety compliance requirements entirely. And that single legal threshold has turned a car's literal birthday into a major market event. Because the R32 generation Skyline GT-R, which first became import-eligible back in 2014 when clean examples traded for roughly $25,000, a price that felt entirely reasonable at the time for a car most Americans had only ever seen in Japanese magazines or video games, now regularly sells for anywhere between $50,000 and $90,000 for well-documented cars, while the R33 generation, freed for import a few years later, has climbed into a comparable range of its own, and the R34 GT-R, arguably the most famous of them all, thanks to its starring role in the Fast and Furious film franchise, a level of cultural exposure that introduced an entire generation of American teenagers to a car they had no legal way of ever actually owning, tells an even more dramatic story. Because a legal loophole exploited by a now-defunct importer whose petition ultimately collapsed under federal scrutiny briefly allowed a small handful of R34s into the country years before the official 25-year window opened. And those grandfathered cars became such rare trophies among desperate, cash-rich enthusiasts that they were trading for six-figure sums even a decade ago. Prices that, remarkably, still look like a bargain today. Because as later R34 GTRs have crossed their own 25-year threshold on a rolling monthly basis throughout 2025 and into 2027, clean examples are now commonly changing hands somewhere between $140,000 and $280,000, an almost unbelievable trajectory for a car that Nissan never even officially sold in the United States to begin with. And this JDM phenomenon isn't limited to Nissan either, because the fourth-generation Toyota Supra, the Mazda RX-7, and the Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution are all crossing that same 25-year import threshold in overlapping waves right now, each one carrying its own devoted following built up over decades of enthusiasts watching from the sidelines through magazines, video games, and grainy imported VHS tapes long before ownership was ever a realistic possibility, meaning American collectors currently have access to an entire generation of once forbidden Japanese performance icons simultaneously flooding into legal eligibility for the very first time. A genuinely unprecedented moment in the hobby's history that simply couldn't have happened at any other point in the past, given how tightly Japan controlled export of these particular models when they were new. But the story of why collectors are buying differently right now extends well beyond Japan, because Hagerty's own official bull market list for 2026, a closely watched annual forecast of vehicles the company expects to see meaningful price appreciation, leans heavily toward exactly this same 1990s and 2000s performance window, highlighting cars like the 2006 through 2013 Chevrolet Corvette Z06, long considered a genuine performance bargain and now drawing rapidly accelerating collector interest as buyers recognize just how much genuine supercar performance was packed into a relatively affordable American package. And the Porsche Carrera GT, a car whose values have already reached well into seven-figure territory as its reputation as one of the last truly analog, driver-focused supercars before the industry pivoted hard toward computer-assisted performance, has only grown stronger with time. A machine that famously offered no stability control and no automated launch assistance at a moment when rivals were already racing in the opposite direction, and there's a deeper cultural thread running underneath all of these individual price movements. Because industry analysts consistently point to a growing appreciation among younger buyers, specifically for what's often called analog driving, manual transmissions, minimal electronic intervention, engines and chassis that respond honestly and directly to driver input, rather than filtering everything through layers of software. A driving experience that's become genuinely rare in an era when even mainstream new cars increasingly come standard with automatic transmissions, driver assistance systems, and semi-autonomous safety features. Features that undeniably make everyday driving safer and easier, but that also, for a meaningful number of enthusiasts, quietly remove exactly the kind of direct mechanical feedback that made driving feel like a genuine skill rather than a passive activity. And that hunger for something more mechanically honest has even revived interest in a category almost nobody would have called glamorous a generation ago: the classic American pickup truck.